I'm Douglas Murray, and it's a great pleasure to have been asked to join you this evening. I wanted to just mention a few things in the short time I have. First is just to mention this: I'm not Jewish myself. I happen to have not just some, but most of my best friends are Jews. But the reason I mention this is that all my adult life I've been surrounded by, or chosen to be surrounded by, Jews. And why should that be? In my secular moments, I'd say it's been luck or good fortune. In my more religious moments, I'd say it's a signal of God's grace, of the wild grace of God. Because for me, these friendships and what I've learned from them have been among the greatest blessings of my life. I've known Ashkenazi Jews and Sephardic Jews. I've known secular Jews, Orthodox Jews, ultra-Orthodox Jews, Chabadnik Jews, and even some Reform. All of these differences are of great importance to many of you and to all of the people who argue them. But they mattered not one jot to the terrorists who broke into Israel on Saturday. They didn't care whether they were killing secular Jews or religious Jews, voters for Likud or voters for Yesh Atid. They didn't care what the views were of the people they were killing, whether they were for or against recent judicial reforms in Israel, whether they were one of the few people who believe they don't know how to run the country, or whether they were one of the 8 million people who believe they do know how to run the country. All that the terrorists cared about was that their victims were Jews. That was it. They had to be Jews. I once asked Jonathan Sacks in private what he thought it meant to be a Jew. And he replied, quite characteristically, by quoting someone else. Specifically, he quoted his friend, the late great philosopher Isaiah Berlin. He said, Douglas, Isaiah once answered this question when he was asked by saying, to be a Jew is to have a sense of history. And I looked at Jonathan, I knew there was something more. He tilted his head. And I said, well, what do you think? He said, I think Isaiah was almost right. And I said, so what's your answer? He said, to be a Jew is to have a sense of memory. Now, memory can be a burden. For some people, an almost impossible burden. But it's also a blessing. Because if you as a people, you as individuals, know what went before, you know that the Jewish people have been here many times before, in many worse situations, and too many times to count. One of my favorite writers, Stefan Zweig, whom my late friend George Weidenfeld, also of London, actually knew in London in the 1930s, both exiles from Vienna. Stefan Zweig, in 1938, in one of his last letters to Joseph Roth, who was soon to die himself in Paris, said from England this in a letter, 1938. He said, every morning I thank the Lord that I am free and in England. But I have an appetite for distant places again, and the desire to see the world in the round once more before it burns. Much as I adore Zweig, it seems imperative to me that we do not fall into the despondency or defeatism that Zweig expressed in that letter, however understandable it was. Because what we know, what he didn't know then, what we know now, is that the Jewish people have seen off every single one of their enemies for millennia. They have outlived every single one of the enemies who've wished to destroy them, from Pharaoh to Hitler. And they will see this enemy off as well. And I say that with absolute certainty. Now, what to do? May I make two suggestions? Firstly, it's always seemed to me that it is not the right of non-Israelis to tell the Israelis what to do. It is up to them to do what they need to do. In my view, all that people in the diaspora and their supporters can say is that they have our love, our support, and our solidarity in the weeks and months ahead. Whatever we can do to support them, we must do. But a second point, if I may. What we can do here in Britain is to keep our own house in order. And our own house in Britain is in disarray. It is not acceptable, it should not be acceptable, that the Jewish community among all of the communities of this country, in this diverse country, should be the one community expected to accept with equanimity those who cheer on the murder of Jews and those who support the murder of Jews. It is not acceptable that the Jewish community should be the only community in this land that is expected to put up with murder and then being scorned for their fellow Jews being murdered. No other community would accept this, and I beg you not to accept it either. I beg you not to accept it. I came back to London the other night and I hear the residue of the people outside the Israeli embassy. These people were not protesting against Israeli countermeasures. They hadn't even had any countermeasures. They were protesting because Jews by the hundreds had been slaughtered in Israel, and they wanted to wound us more. Well, they might try, but we should not accept that with equanimity. I've written in The Spectator tomorrow